To hear something about terrorism, but really the major portion, and as you will see, there are two types of terrorists: the native terrorists and the foreign terrorists, and they are completely different from one another. The psychology is completely different from one another. Where they are coming from is completely different from one another, and what motivates them is completely different from one another. Though they share certain characteristics in common, but that's not going to be the major part of my presentation. The major part of my presentation really is about treason, and what I told you a moment ago, spooks and spies. And let me tell you a little bit about this. It's obviously an extraordinary neglected subject, as you will see in a moment, very little in the psychoanalytic literature relating to these various subjects, and yet we do have an enormous amount of useful theoretical models that can very well help us to understand a lot of these things. And I'm going to try and show you what are the kind of changes in the personality structure of individuals that grow in a culture and suddenly treason, become traitors, and sell the country. In other words, they are settling, as you will see in a moment, the motherland and the fatherland. And I want to remind you that we are experts at understanding the Oedipus complex, which essentially means there is a child, there is a mother, and there is a father, and there are interactions in this triangle. If you extend the father into the concept of the fatherland, and the mother into the concept of the motherland, as indeed it happens at some point once you grow out of your Oedipus complex and become an adult, you will have some of the background that you need to understand the lecture. As you know, I'm a very avid reader of biographies. I have written some. And the reason for that is that I think you learn an awful lot of looking at the whole life context of an individual, rather than if you have just a cross-section of somebody during the number of years that you may have in psychotherapy or psychoanalysis or whatever. Here you have a bird view look at the span of life with the beginning and the end of it and all that happening between, and if there is sufficient documentation, that's quite a trip, you know. It's like a very long, very interesting vacation with very varied landscapes and interesting subjects to look at. That in itself is interesting. This is particularly interesting, and I developed this interest when I was living in England, actually, for a number of reasons. One book or two books I will recommend to you. I could only bring one, I couldn't find the other. I overslept this morning. My library is not in the best order possible, but this is called The Private Life of Kim Philby. This is a very famous spy. Some people here that are from England will remember him very well. You say, well, what is the interest in this man? Well, this gentleman and two associates of him sold Europe to communism for 50 years and condemned Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and East Germany to slavery for 50 years and to incredible totalitarian, dictatorial, humiliating conditions. This gentleman is responsible for the deaths of 300 of his fellow agents. He got to be the chief of MI4 in England. That's the equivalent of the CIA here, and of course he had the greatest clearance of all, and he has access during the war to the communications between Roosevelt and Churchill. And he knew that Churchill and Roosevelt were tired of the war and had discussed what would happen if the Russians decided to invade Europe. And he heard that they were going to do nothing about it, that they had enough of the war, which he immediately put in Stalin's ear. And you know what he did? that changed the face of the world. It nearly ended the world as we know it. We may have forgotten about the Cold War, but we should. We are in a similar dangerous situation now for different reasons. And that reactivated my interest. In fact, I wrote this paper several years ago and, for my own enjoyment and entertainment, and so decided to reactivate it. In fact, talking about the spies, the paper became like a mole. I had it somewhere, and at some point, like you do with moles, you know what a mole is? You reactivate them and make them operative. Meanwhile, you have been thinking about it and training them and preparing them to get to places. As you will see, there were some other people that were responsible for this. And I don't know if you are aware of this. I, of course, am very familiar with the life of the Rosenbergs. And I don't know how you pronounce that. F-O-C-H. I'm not trying to show but I'm not sure how it is appropriately pronounced. And some other notorious people which essentially make it possible for Stalin to have the atomic war, the atomic plan for an atomic bomb before we exploded the one in Hiroshima. And that could have been the end of us. Now, many of you that don't have too much of an interest in these things may not be familiar with another book. This is A Private Life of King Philby. It's a relatively new book. It covers the whole span of his life. And it was written in 1999. There is an earlier book, which I think is a better book, or it goes more to the point, called Philby, The Spy That Betrayed a Generation, and it was written by three very well-known English journalists. I strongly recommend you read it. There is another book that if you have an interest, you should read. It's called the Venona Papers, and it's hardly known. Some of you shake your head, so I guess you saw them. If you read the Venona Papers, you will see. Let me tell you what it is. The Venona Papers essentially is the KGB archives open to the public and published. And they clearly demonstrate with names of individuals, position they occupy in this country, in the government, what family they belong to, what branch of the government they belong to, what kind of spying they did for the Russians at that time. And I hate to tell you that there were tens of thousands of Americans that betrayed this country, all of which I named in that book. It was not invented by anybody. This is from the KGB files now open to the public. And I think you would remember a fellow by the name of McCarthy that we saw the wars off. Well, unfortunately, apparently, though, he went about it in the wrong kind of way. He was right. This book, in a way, exonerates him. People say, I saw a communist spy inside, underneath every stone in America, and particularly in the film industry and so on. Well, if you read the Venona Papers, you will find that many of the people that he saw were spies. And that many of them were in the film industry, but they were not only them. They were assistants to Franklin D. Roosevelt. And so Stalin knew exactly everything that was discussed in the office of Roosevelt. Sometime before, many of his associates knew what this was. Now, you don't think that's important? I respect your opinion. I think it's incredibly important, and quite frankly, I think we stand as a free country today by the grace of God and by the ability of some of our politicians. If you look at the Venona books, you wonder how we could have survived. Okay? So that's the reason why I got interested in it. It may not be of interest to you, it was to me. What other reasons were of interest to me? Well, I immediately saw the role of the Oedipus complex, as you know. Freud is very big in thinking that the Oedipus complex is a great organizer of human development, and it really will determine a lot of your character traits and personality and your likes and dislikes and your range of performance possibilities in life and so on. Those of you that are familiar with Totem and Taboo will find an echo of that book in what is happening today in a different form, but very similar to it. And in the course of reviewing this, we will have a chance to look at certain forms of pathology that tend to play a significant role in those that are going to become traitors, indeed in those that are going to become terrorists. And it's good to know these things. In any case, that's a brief introduction, so you have an idea why I want to do these things. Now, the subject of treatment has received very scanty treatment in the psychoanalytic literature. Perhaps one of the reasons is that there is in each one of us, at the very least, a minor traitor. In inverted commas, a minor traitor. The fact that we cannot but contemplate with some horror, some fear, and much shame. I refer to the fact that given the nature of the Oedipus complex and the role that bisexuality plays in the constellation you will finally adopt, positive and negative, we have all been guilty of treason, insofar as we have all wanted to depose the sovereign father and or the queen mother and occupy their respective places. There are then the multiple consequences and derivations of the above all through our childhood and developmental histories. Edward Glover, a very well-known English psychoanalyst, in his book, The Psychology of Fear and Courage, which is a wonderful book, describes graphically what I have in mind when he says, and this is a quote, "Those who retain vivid memories of the senior side of childhood, family and school life, will have little difficulty in recognizing some of the predisposing causes of Quislingism." You may not be familiar with the term Quislingism. It's derived from a notorious Second War Norwegian traitor, very famous, responsible for the destruction of Norway. He sold it to the Russians by the name of Major Quisling. And the kinds of behavior which is a paradigm have since then received this qualification as Quislingism. To continue with the quote, this is Glover speaking, "The simple case of the younger son who gives away an older brother, the schoolboy who sneaks to the teacher, the child with a grievance against his parents who idealizes the head of the household next door." End of quote. If one adds to this our natural ambivalence, our tendency to love and hate the same object, one can see the fertile ground for later forms of what I would refer to as benign or minor forms of treason. I believe this phenomenon to be quite common and possibly an unavoidable fact of life. And I hope that I will demonstrate that very clearly to you in a moment. But it is not this type of treason, interesting as it may be, in the multiple varieties and dynamics that this paper addresses itself to, just a reference to it. Beyond Glover, there is a paper by James Alexander which deals briefly with the issues of dissent and particularly treason and sedition as the more destructive forms of dissent. He concluded that, quote, "intrapsychically, treason or a strong treasonable and seditious potentiality implicate large areas of the total personality and the character structure of the individual in a pathological process," end of quote. As he sees it, quote again, "the primary structural site of these pathological processes are defects in the superego and the ego ideal," and I will demonstrate that to you, I think, very clearly in a moment. Greenacre refers to, quote, a fissure-like defect in the superego, including the conscience and formation of ideals of the traitor, to which he adds, quote, the invasion of emotional relationship by the excessive need for possession and power, growing out of unusually strong and unresolved infantile jealousy, distortion of the sense of identity, sometimes with secondary disturbances in reality testing. End of quote. And you will see that in the examples that I will give you. There's a book about Ezra Pound, the poet, written by Cass, called Ezra Pound, Creativity and Treason, Clues from His Life and Work. That's the title of the book, if you know the poet. And he throws some light on the role of Pound's manic depressive illness. Perhaps one should say schizoaffective disorder. In his diatribe against the United States, Roosevelt, and the Jews broadcasted from Rome during the war, in particular in 1941. This is in America. They led in 1945, once the war was finished, to a charge of giving aid and comfort to the enemy. But his paper doesn't discuss treason as such. Jacobson, Eddie Jacobson, that I'm sure you're familiar with, in her paper, The Paranoid Urge to Betray, describes the tendency of patients, this is a quote, patients with paranoid personality structure to commit acts of betrayal as an expression of a major intrapsychic conflict. And there is some paranoid element in all of these types of behavior. From the above, it's clear that treason can take many forms, appear in many contexts, and obey many causes. It is clear, too, that we are in need of some systematization of the many possible varieties of this phenomena, if individuals and nations are going to be able to protect themselves from the severe forms of it. But first, we need to clearly define the terms that we will be using. The definition of the term treason, according to the Scribner-Bantam English Dictionary, reads as follows. Betrayal of what do you say this? Allegiance.
Allegiance or alliance?
Allegiance. Betrayal of allegiance to one's own sovereign or country, as by yielding vital secrets or aiding an enemy in time of war. Treachery is defined in the same dictionary as treasonable disloyal conduct, betrayal of trust, treason, faithlessness. The definition of traitor is one who betrays another trust or is false to an obligation or duty. 2, one who commits treason. For my purposes, I will define treason in somewhat more general terms. Thus, I define treason as follows. A betrayal of the allegiance or trust that is due one's country, family, friends, meaningful relationships, and one's general principles. And this is important. One's general ethical principles. A traitor, in my judgment, is the person who commits such a betrayal. Sometimes it's not against anybody, it's about themselves and their standards. The concept of treason implies that the treacherous act or behavior constituted a significant, even a radical departure from expected behavior in any given situation. The concept includes that the treacherous act or behavior actually causes or could cause significant distress, damage, and so on to one or more individuals, to the self, and all to generally accepted principles, as well as to nations, be that your own or others. It similarly includes the idea that such behavior or acts of treason would be considered unacceptable, highly undesirable, or even outrageous by a large majority of those people who share a similar cultural background with a traitor. And that's important, that it will be considered undesirable or outrageous by a large majority of those people who share a similar cultural background with a traitor. The implications that follow is that the act of treason will automatically call for the condemnation of the relevant social group. With treachery and treason, as would have been noticed from the definition, may occur and be relevant in the context of two individuals, such as two friends, two colleagues, spouses, lovers, and so on. The betrayed one will show very similar reactions to those described concerning larger groups of individuals, nations, and the like. It is immediately apparent then that the severity of the treacherous act in the ethical sense of the word and in terms of its consequences fall in a continuum. At one extreme, the treacherous act will be considered reprehensible and the consequences of it may have catastrophic proportions. And I gave you some examples of that already. They were not as catastrophic as they could have been, but they were catastrophic enough, particularly for a very large number of millions of human beings in Western Europe. At the other end, there will be those acts that, though similar reprehensible in the ethical sense, do not imply the same seriousness in terms of the importance of the principles violated and the severity of the consequences described above. In between, there would be all kinds of gradations. To simplify matters a little, we could refer to the higher extreme of the continuum as malignant or major treason or treachery, and to the lower extreme of the continuum as benign or minor treachery or treason. Those affected by it will not consider it so. Thus, some sort of it is my contention that the malignant or major forms of treachery or treason can only occur in certain type of individuals, with certain specific constellation of conflicts that I will try to describe to you, or if you will, a specific and quite complex forms of psychopathology with very idiosyncratic developmental characteristics, dynamics, defense abilities, and personality traits, and they are all describable. Now, don't take me wrong. Profiles are always bound to fail. You're describing some general characteristics that apply generally, but there are exceptions to all rules. But if you look at the large number of the major traitors as known to us, and with the information that is available, all of them tend to share these characteristics. So they are, in theory, one could predict that they have the potential for this behavior. I should add then that though all major traitors share these traits, the reverse is not necessarily true. That is, not all those that share these traits are destined to become major traitors. Thus, some sort of narcissistic fault, talking about the characteristics of the personality, is a sine qua non element in the personality of the malignant traitor. Why do I say that? Because you only have to read the biographies. They have problems with self-esteem, self-regard, self-esteem regulation, feelings of self-worth. They have a variety of things that I will describe to you as we go along. But this must not be understood to mean that such a formula is specific to him and not to other forms of personality disturbances or psychopathology. Indeed, the opposite will be much closer to the truth. In other words, narcissistic faults are quite common and widespread and are seen in many of the so-called character disorders. Narcissistic disturbances in the various forms of borderline personalities. And yet, the large majority of such individuals that belong to the three groups just mentioned do not partake of the other significant characteristics and developmental events that give the final and genuine hallmark to the potential traitor and his psychology, which in my view constitutes a very specific and idiosyncratic group of individuals. Let me tell you a little bit about the role of the ego. one of the characteristics of all these characters, I call it one of the characteristics of the hallmark of the trait, is a good, intact, and not infrequently excellent, if not brilliant, ego. I mean here, of course, in the cognitive, functional, intellectual sense only, since in other areas the egos may well be somewhat impaired or dysfunctional. When you look at self-esteem regulation and feelings of self-worth and the rest of it, sense of personal identity and things like that. Clinically too, it will be observed that the genuine trait is highly prone to be narcissistically injured. These are very sensitive people, which, given his deficits in this area, the narcissistic fault, as given his deficits in this area, frequently happens to them. In other words, they frequently feel slighted. The narcissistic elements in the personalities are clearly discernible and visible as the cause of these injuries, as are the attempts, maladaptive or not, to restore their narcissistic integrity, or in other words, good feelings about himself. Improving their self-esteem is a constant struggle for these people, and as you will see, surprisingly, the act of treason achieves that for them in the most interesting of ways. That there are significant narcissistic problems in the malignant trait is shown by the difficulty seen regarding the self-esteem regulation, self-regard, and feelings of self-worth, and problems with their identities. This is clearly visible in the biographies of most major spies prior to the act of treason. One in the genuine traitor, which you will get to be very familiar with as we progress in this lecture, that changed dramatically. Dramatically, in a very interesting way. They exemplify, these characters, the type of profile that the Russians had drawn in the 20s and 30s and early 40s, before the war, in order to identify possible recruiters, particularly in Oxford and Cambridge in England. That's where they wanted to recruit them. And all of these characters were students either in Oxford or Cambridge. Not only King Philby, but a fellow called Burks and another called MacLean. They were all brilliant people. They were recruited in the youth, and they were set as moles. They were directed to occupy the important positions, and once they were there, they were activated. It took 20, 30 years in some cases. They were recruited while in college and were developed through many years. These were the general characteristics. All of them were very bright, so they could eventually occupy important positions in government. That's when they were being recruited. Two, and this was essential, they had to have poor father figures in their lives. Non-interested fathers, absent fathers, or fathers that play little or no role in their life. And this contributed to their narcissistic injuries because their fathers never took an interest in them. This is typical of the large majority of them, and it was an important trait that those that were in the business of recruiting spies for the communist Russia watched very closely among the cleverest students at Cambridge and Oxford, and I assume in this country as well. Then they had to have poor self-esteem, poor self-regard, and feeling of self-worth. You will say, what was important? The fact that the fathers were absent, and in fact not very much liked, maybe resented and hated for their abandonment. Remember that in the triangle of the Oedipus complex, after father comes the fatherland, right? And it's easy as you grow older in life and confront the life situation to act out this in terms of the fatherland, which means your country. Let me, I hope that most of you are familiar with a Kleinian concept which is called the combined parents. The Oedipus complex is child, father, and mother, and that's the way it is. In the combined parents fantasy, the child feels that the parents have associated against him. So there is not a mother and a father, there is a unit. And now, mother and father are one thing. Just like motherland and fatherland become one thing. In the definitions of motherland and fatherland, there is no difference. If you look at the dictionaries, which is interesting. In any case, the would-be traitor, and this is now talking a little bit about the Oedipus complex and treason, reaches the Oedipus complex handicapped by narcissistic lacks. Incidentally, this is usually related to problems during the primary narcissistic stage. That is a phase where the mother regulates the feelings of well-being of the baby and the young toddler. And there are failures in that stage. And so the concept of the self that is developing is not a good concept of the self. It's one that is handicapped by the inability of the mother to regulate the feelings of the infant. Typical and specific for them, there is, for this very reason, an enormous unsatisfied wish for the father's love. Mother failed. They look to father as they grow older. And so they have an enormous, typically all of these kids whose father were not interested in them at the same time, have an enormous interest in the father's love, attention, and admiration that for various reasons, and frequently through no fault of their own, they do not seem to be able to attain. Thus a tormentuous and ambivalent attitude towards the father, who doesn't think much of them, or does not pay them enough attention, or simply didn't care for them, is quite a common complaint and an important part in the dynamics of the traitor in the earlier years and later on in life. Generally, and that applies to Philby, Burbs, McLean, all the major spies, Fox, all of them. Thus far, this is not very different. Generally, as one would expect, by the time the traitor is an adult, he reactively and defensively may think very poorly of this father that he had longed for, or see him as a weak man, or as a worthless man, a man of little accomplishment or value. Now, if you read the biography of Philby, you will see that very clearly demonstrated. He had a father who was an important person, actually. And he ended by demeaning him in ways that you say, is he out of his mind? And he was not out of his mind. But this is part of the psychopathology of this phenomenon. Thus far, this is really not very different from the developmental history of many other human beings. The difference consists in what this patient needs from the parents. Somewhere between the ages of 2.5 and 5, which is the peak of the Oedipus complex, he longs for the father as the only possible restorer of his narcissistic damage and needs. Father's admiration, attention, and love, much more than mother's, was felt as a palliative whenever it was experienced. Perhaps this is due in part to the fact that the early narcissistic injuries do happen in the context of the mother-child relationship when they take place in the first year of life. On the other hand, the same is true of if the narcissistic problems come from the beginning of the secondary narcissistic stage, that again happens to start with essentially in the context of the mother-child relationship. The mother is not only the first meaningful object of the child, but the regulation of the child's self-esteem and the establishment of a self and self-regard is mostly dependent on the interaction with her at the beginning of life, and then it gets transferred to other places. If it is faulty there, it will be faulty everywhere. The father, as we know, plays at this very early stage and in relative terms a very secondary role. Thus, with the move to the triangular awareness, and relationships that are characteristic of the Oedipus complex later on in life, between the ages of 2.5 and 5, the father's importance and significance comes into his own, not only vis-a-vis the child's relation to his mother, but in regard to many other developmental processes. It is now, and because of the earlier failure of the mother-child interaction to help him regain a stable narcissistic feeling, that the figure of the father as a possible restorer or healer of the narcissistic injuries becomes all important. In this type of psychopathology, the father, for the above reasons, is seen as omnipotent and omniscient, and as the only promise of relief. And as you will see, in the act of treason, the relief comes from the fatherland, the new fatherland. Given that the basic fault cannot be corrected in reality by all of the father's admiration, given that this type of child is highly prone to narcissistic injuries through any real or imagined neglect, he is soon disappointed in him. Further, given that the child's Oedipal striving for the mother are in conflict with this special longing for the father, the situation cannot but end catastrophically. From that moment onwards, the father, and later by extension the fatherland, in a displacement way that is very interesting, I will show you, becomes the subject of a sordid discontent. He is seen as unfair, unjust to his children, unwilling to recognize their merits, to soothe their pains, to restore their well-being, in short, to give them their dues. Now, retranslate this in your own minds into complaints about society's social ills and our governments and what they do to us and to other nations later on. That's what it is. The reinforcement of these hostile and destructive feelings that come from the positive Oedipus complex seals the fate of the father, potentially the fatherland too, and the child. He will be forced into the path of revenge, and since his unconscious hate knows no limits now, sooner or later, in one form or another, he will attempt to destroy the father or the fatherland. The act of treason will become the means to his revenge and to the symbolic destruction of the father. The act of treason itself needs to be examined and understood in all its ramification and its symbolic meaning in order to clarify the psychology of the traitor. Thus, in the potential traitor, the disappointment in the father's ability or willingness to make him whole drive him to the disappointing mother, now dressed in his new Oedipal robes. Two developmental currents now converge and reinforce each other, and the outcome is as much the result of an act of revenge toward the father as of interest in the mother. From this moment onwards, his whole psychic life and endeavors will be devoted to supplant the father, to surpass him in terms of the mother's affection, indeed to take possession of her. Here again, we are in the familiar territory of the Oedipus complex, but there is a significant difference in the trait of psychology that makes his Oedipus complex somewhat unique. For him, it is not enough to gain the affection of the mother at the expense of the father, or to surpass him in her affection, while the best wishes are kept strictly confined to the realm of fantasy, as would undoubtedly be the case with normal people or with neurotic patients. Unfortunately, in the case of malignant traitors, and others, terrorists, this destructive fantasy must be acted out in real life as the conquest of the mother is acted out in real life, though in a displaced form. What I want to underline at this point is a similar necessity for the traitor to act out at times in a very concrete, specific and dramatic manner the destruction of the father. Think, for example, of the actual assassination or attempts at assassination of presidents in this country or of political leaders around the world, all through history. Of course, this this is a stream of the destructive acting out continues towards the father, frequently carried out by psychotic or otherwise very disturbed people. At the other end of the same continuum, there are infinitely numerous but somewhat less dramatic examples, though not necessarily less malignant, of the same behavior. All this is in sharp contrast with the simple, normal, or neurotic vicissitudes of the Oedipus complex of human beings that do not reach the acting out heights and proportions that I have described now. Indeed, the authority of the father figure gets embedded in the superego of the normal or neurotic individual. From there, it modulates and controls behavior so that these intended violent, savage, damaging acts, whether they include an actual death or not, or they actually result or not in the malignant consequences that are desired, are forbidden and cannot be enacted. These acts can only be performed in the case of the ordinary neurotic personality in a highly displayed, symbolic, and mostly non-vicious form. This difference I consider of the greatest significance and of important differential diagnostic value. But this is by no means the only important difference. Perhaps more important is the fact that the rage towards the father must include the simultaneous damage, the sell-out, or the symbolic destruction of that which the child thought to be the most important thing to the father, and by, that is, his wife, the father's wife, or in other words, the child's own mother, and by extension, the motherland. It is thus a doubly vicious blow that must be accorded the father, usually in the form of a symbolic substitute in the case of traitors. What I have in mind here can best be exemplified by the many and nowadays quite common stories of spies, moles, and traitors. In other words, at the same time that the father is betrayed, including in the very act of betrayal, is the sellout of the mother, i.e. the motherland. And you have a combined fantasy of early infancy. Let me give you the multiple scenarios of treason. What I am saying is that the Oedipus complex can and is reenacted in a large variety of scenarios. There is, for example, one's country as representative of the mother, who is felt as possessed, controlled, and in the hands of the politicians in power, presidents and prime ministers, who thus become surrogate father figures. In a smaller scenario, such as a corporation, the corporation itself represents the mother, it's the motherland. And the president of the corporation, chairman of the board, etc., represent the father, who is seen as in possession of the mother, the motherland. It goes without saying that the many forms of the childhood Oedipus complex are frequently reactivated and acted out in these different type of scenarios. It's quite common. Analysts are very aware of that. I can say, without a shadow of a doubt, after having been for over 7 years, having the experience for over 7 years as the director of a major program and a major hospital in a major university, that is the University of Michigan. I ran all of the youth services of the University of Michigan and the Children's Psychiatric Hospital and the Hospital for Adolescents. That such a position automatically places one in the situation of a father figure vis-a-vis the hospital or the university. The latter two, that is the hospital, the university, the programs, represent the mother, seen as owned, possessed, and controlled by the director father. The staff members become frequently the children of the family and reenact the sibling rivalry among themselves in their attempts to gain the goodwill of the parents, mother hospital, father director. Very common. Anybody with administrative responsibility is very familiar with it. If any rational decision is made by the father director, that prove beneficial to one member of the staff. This is, of course, in dysfunctional systems, and a lot have been written about dysfunctional systems by Otto Kemper and others, where systems, like let's say this department of psychiatry, is like a family. It has a father and have mothers and have children, and they act out to their heart's content, unless, the person responsible as a father figure can put some reins in this behavior, and at times that's nearly impossible. It leads to major drastic forms of solving the problem. You are smiling, I'm sure you have seen this many times. So have I, old enough to have been there. Now, so if any rational decision is made by the father director that prove beneficial to one member of the staff, the other children, in inverted comma children, get quite upset, wondering why it is that they are not automatically bestowed a similar or greater favor. By the same token, the father director position is inevitably, it's a fact of life, eyed by the younger and common ambitious professional as a highly desirable situation. In their fantasies, they long to oust the father and take possession of the mother. At times, the situation becomes, for a detached observer, like a three-ring circus. I have been in several of them, unfortunately. In my opinion, the success of the father director in running an efficient organization is very much dependent on his ability to recognize all the above and to reduce it to rational proportions. Disturbing and disruptive as this situation can become, they obviously lack the malignancy that we see in other cases, as long as they involve only the acting out of the Oedipus complex of neurotic individuals. Unfortunately, though, all this myriad of possible scenarios, particularly those at the national government level and international politics, are populated by individuals whose character structure and personality embodies forms of psychopathology that must be considered somewhat outside the neurotic realm, though not necessarily psychotic. Such individuals may be potentially dangerous in rather lethal ways. Naturally, and I tell you, we have them by the tens of thousands, as I told you in the Verona papers. Yeah. Hey, don't believe me? Read the book. Naturally, the same line of thought would apply to actually psychotic individuals, since their enactment of the Oedipal fantasies in real life is not subjected to reality testing, and is furthermore under the compulsive motivational forces of the delusional ideas that disturb thought processes and the lack of good judgment. All of this combined makes them particularly dangerous, as the assassination attempt in the case of President Reagan so clearly demonstrated. These men wanted to kill Reagan, Jodie Foster, with whom he was in love. And Jodie Foster is a replacement for the mother, and Reagan is a replacement for the father. That he was so much more powerful than the father and could kill him, and she should love him. Because he was psychotic, still I believe he's in Washington in the appropriate place. I hope he's kept there. Yet many attempts at political assassination are done by so-called political idealists, the discontented and or fanatics who cannot, by any stretch of the imagination, be considered psychotics or borderline. They have a different kind of character structure. The kind of treachery I'm trying to deal with here can be observed in many different contexts and acquire many forms. The three most notorious British spies, Philby, McLean, and Burgess, after years of spying for the Russians, defected to the Soviet Union, where they ended their lives. Once the covers were blown apart, which took nearly 30 years. Are another example of the various forms that lethal damaging treason can take. The extent of the damage done by these individuals is difficult to ascertain. But I told you what it was. They were responsible for the change for 50 years in the face of the world and in the enslavement of millions and millions of human beings under the most horrendous totalitarian regimes. The biographical studies of spies and the observation and treatment of patients with the makeup of the personality of the traitor, the psychology of the traitor, throw some light on the mechanism of defense that are frequently employed by such characters, as well as some of the various other conflicts involved. Let me tell you a little bit about it. Thus, for example, the passive homosexual longings for the father remain quite active all through their life and constitute a constant source of conflict that represents a serious threat to the masculinity of those in this group that have achieved a more clear sexual identity. In such cases, the I don't love you, I hate you type of defense mechanism becomes operative to deny the homosexual longing. Denial in action by means of unnecessary defiance and militant attitude against, in quotes, father figures, is of course seen as are all the varieties of difficulties in relating and accepting figures in authority, pecking orders, and hierarchical structure. Incidentally, in the Russian profile was included difficulties with your sexual identity for two clear reasons. One, you could not identify if you were a man with your father, so your father-like concept was not well established. You know? What you will do with that was not well established. And two, you were highly susceptible to blackmail. Now let me talk a little bit, and we're getting to the end, a few more minutes, about treason, externalization, projection, rationalization, and intellectualization, which are, if you look at the traitors and the behavior and how they remain sane after being responsible for these horrendous consequences, is really a marvel piece of psychological engineering. And it's all explained by the type of defenses that they use. So another hallmark is the nearly incredible tendency of these patients to externalize, to project, to rationalize, and intellectualize their own inner designs. Typically, the genuine traitor is generally unaware of the true nature of his intentions. And I mean the genuine traitor, not the one that is a traitor for money. It's the one that is a traitor for ideas and doesn't have any economic gains about it. That's the ones I'm talking about. That genuine traitor is generally unaware of the true nature of his intention or his actual treachery when it occurs. Though obvious to everyone else, in most cases he is totally oblivious of his behavior and the consequences of the situation he may well have created. This incredible feat is due to an enormous amount of denial that they use in combination with other defenses. In fact, the genuine traitor managed to believe that his behavior is fully justified morally and ethically, and believe that as you believe whatever your most firm beliefs are. He believes that. And he managed to do it by a number of ways. So, as I said, the genuine traitor does manage to believe that his behavior is fully justified ethically and morally. Indeed, they see it as the only honorable behavior left to somebody who thinks of himself as they do, as a highly principled individual that is trying to correct injustices, in inverted commas, or stop the unprincipled behavior of others, in inverted commas, or to correct what are considered by them, in inverted commas, intolerable social ills. As a result, they are led to idealize with the help, and this is important, the idealization, with the help of many rationalizations and intellectualization, socio-political regimes that are in fact paradigmatic of those evils that they mean to correct. And they don't see that. Even many of these converters, when Stalin, for example, kill 8 million peasants in Russia. They found justification to that behavior, and it didn't change any. These rationalizations, intellectualizations, and idealizations of these regimes. Obviously, to get to that result, that is, to maintain the course, substantial amount of analysis, idealization, rationalization, and intellectualizations are necessary. These defense mechanisms are used on an ad hoc basis, or in other words, in a specific situation that arise suddenly, and where the patient, in order to be congruent with himself and his belief, to remain sane, to keep his psychic order and integrity, must achieve quickly a considerable distortion of both his internal and external reality. That's what was happening to many of these people when they read in the paper that Stalin had eliminated 8 million peasants. To remain sane, to remain congruent, to remain consistent, they had to very quickly resort to this compound defense mechanism. Still more important is the fact that these type of defenses are needed constantly in place as well, in order to keep internal and external reality permanently distorted. These people have had to distort their internal realities and their external reality in incredible manners, but that must not be recognized. In this way, they escape the overwhelming conflicts that would otherwise arise with the accompanying guilt, anxiety, and depressing feelings that need to be constantly warded off. It follows that many of the traitors do in fact, build a character structure that fulfills a double purpose. On the one hand, it solves the conflict that would otherwise become manifest. On the other hand, it actually allows an idealization of the objectionable behavior that they have engaged in, so that the genuinely traitor actually believes he acts motivated by the highest of principles. He wants a better world. And the better world is a promise of communism in the 30s and 20s. Page, Leach, and Knightley, which are the authors of Philby, the Spy Who Betrayed a Generation, which accounts for the life and exploit of the 3 British traitors mentioned, Philby, Burgess, and McLean, stated, this is a quote, essentially, they were moved by a quasi-religious faith. They believed the Soviet Union was somehow cleaner, purer, and better than their own country because it claimed to have adopted communism. Like religious zealots in many ages before, they will justify everything in their careers: treachery, cruelty, treason, even murder, by pointing to the cause. Like the chorus in Brecht's classic communist revolution play, it's a play that was very famous called The Measures Taken. There is a chorus that chants repeatedly. They would say, what baseness would you not commit to root out baseness? In other words, you are familiar with the aim justifies the means kind of system. Let me talk a little bit about treason and distortion of the superego and new ideas. I want you to notice and reflect a little bit on the distortions that all this implies in terms of the ego and the superego ideas. It has to be pointed out that these mechanisms are the ones frequently operative in the ego and superego idea formation of the doctrinaire, the fanatic, the terrorist, and other similar fellow travelers. The importance of this in terms of the struggles among various political ideologies, socio-philosophical systems, and so on, cannot escape anybody. One only needs to be reminded of the recent acts of terrorism, such as the attempted assassination of the Pope, the assassination of President Sadat, the events in Iran, the Oklahoma bombing by what I call a native terrorist, Mabey, the Pan Am incident, the Twin Towers in New York, the suicide bombings in Israel, unending, and so on. Of course, the same line of thought applies to the assassination of President Kennedy, the attempts on the life of Truman, Ford, Reagan, and others, just to mention a few. Indeed, one gets a distinct impression that the potentially lethal psychological structures and conflicts that characterize the personality of some of these individuals is more easily actualized when a social, philosophical, political, or religious, the case of the terrorists now, vehicle is found, offering the opportunity to create such idealizations. By such means, the otherwise objectionable potential behavior is turned into a highly desirable, actual one by individuals operating within such systems. It is perhaps for these reasons that at times when there are increases in the socio-economic, political, philosophical, and religious struggles, we generally see these violent acts acquire epidemic proportions, while in more normal periods they are more in the nature of isolated events and more within the endemic proportions. Another no less important component of the hallmark of the personality of the traitor is the direct consequences of the generous use made of externalization and projection. Deep down, the traitors are fearful individuals. They can, in many cases, show a cool and calm demeanor, but deep down, and in their fantasy life, they are enormously suspicious of everybody else's intention vis-a-vis them. In the few patients that I have seen, and they were not spies, but there were major traitors within in the national or international scene, that I have seen of this type in analysis. And let me tell you, they were ordinary patients, not spies. Not everyone with a recipe to become a traitor does so. There is a question of opportunity, proselytism, and very many other factors that determine the final outcome. These patients were better defined as minor traitors, but this is what they show. Hours and hours on end were spent discussing and examining the imagined negative intentions, plots, and counterplots that are being fabricated against them. Occasionally, such concerns reach truly paranoid proportions, though the type of patient I am referring to here is not a psychotic patient. The world is for them a jungle, where in every corner, behind every tree, there is a conspiracy to smear, depossess, or otherwise damage them. The remarkable thing is the absolute blindness and the extraordinary resistance this type of patient display to any attempt to show them that what they fear from this or that individual, this or that situation, is really nothing more in most cases than their own intentionality externalized, as well as a result of the liberal use of a mechanism of projection. And you sweat blood, and they can see that. Self-esteem, regulation, and treason, and this is important and unbelievable. Finally, let me refer briefly to one very puzzling aspect of the psychology of the genuine traitor. It concerns the issue of the regulation of the self-esteem, since given their original narcissistic fall, it remains a constant and special problem. We should know, too, the damage that overflows to the self-image, self-identity, sexual identity, and particularly feelings of self-worth and self-regard for people in that situation. It is interesting to realize that the preparatory stage to the act of treason, up to the point when the distortion of the internal and external realities are put in place, and the final idealized ego system is put in position, achieve quite efficiently what nothing else has achieved up to this point. In other words, they seem to heal over the narcissistic wounds, in some cases more or less permanently, and at the very least temporarily. Similarly, a high degree of resolution is achieved in terms of the problems that pertain to the self-images, feeling of self-worth, self-regard, personal identity, and self-esteem regulation. It should be the opposite, but this incredible feat is achieved because the new systems of ideas that substituted for the older one are the new measurements against which the ego gets assessed, and they are fulfilling successfully its requirements. Out of that interaction, they get a new self-image. They are now highly moral and ethical individuals, acting in the highest principles that you can think of and risking everything for such principles. If that doesn't fit you with secondary narcissistic affects of your own, even if they are somewhat delusional and quasi-psychotic, nothing else does. Let alone that those that handle your reins are telling you that you are the last greatest thing to happen to the world in the moral, ethical sense, because you are struggling for a better world. Out of that interaction, they get a new self-image. Now that they are totally devoted to the new highly idealized cause, and that they work consistently, loyally, very loyally, like they never did before, and persistently for it, they become a new persona. In inverted commas, a new persona whose new systems of ideas generously rewards their efforts. For the first time, perhaps, they come as close to a feeling of completeness and wholeness as they will ever have. For the first time, their wounds seem as if they were healing, their self-esteem improving. For the first time, too, they feel truly important, enormously important, and recognized as enormously important by important displaced father figures in a different fatherland. We need to understand now how the substitution of the old introjects and ideas that regulated and modulated behavior previous to the change comes about. We are, after all, well aware that these introjects, whatever the nature, are stable structures that are not easily, if at all, changeable. We do know, of course, of situations in which this is possible under special circumstances. And referring here to the phenomena that take place generally under the auspices of group psychology. Under such conditions, substantial aspects of an individual's standards are substituted by those of the leader, at least temporarily. As Freud pointed out in group psychology and the analysis of the ego that you should reread, is very topical today. Under these conditions, such individuals are capable of behaviors that would be objectionable to them under normal circumstances. Looking in that direction, we can further understand by which means the genuine traitor, the one that does it for ideal, not for money or diamonds like these later ones, and some terrorists, and by some I mean the native one, the one that were born and grown here, manages the many changes that take place in his internal world, because they do the same. They idealize this new set of ideas and see the present politicians and government and so on as the ego to be eliminated, as the core that they must deliver to the nation, and hence the Oklahoma building tragedy. So this is the way they manage the many changes that take place in the internal world. Two factors are relevant here. First, there is a gradual cathexis in the most intense manner of a group of highly idealized, abstract ideas, though generally quite distorted and deformed for anybody else. To this is added the second factor, that is, at some point, and in some cases, he joins others, either overtly or covertly, that are similarly devoted to the cause. Thus, the idealized but generally distorted abstract ideas become the most significant object, capable of substituting as new superego introjects for the earlier ones. This is now a set of ideas that have come to take the place of the superego. Freud very precisely described this by saying, this is a quote, listen to it carefully. Contemporaneously with this, devotion of the ego to the object, which is no longer to be distinguished from a sublimated devotion to an abstract idea, the functions allotted to the ego ideal, i.e. the superego, entirely cease to operate for these individuals. The criticism exercised by that agency is now silent. Everything that the object, new object, does and asks for is right and is blameless. Conscience has no application to anything that is done for the sake of the object, which is now a set of ideas, an idealized system. In the blindness of love, he continues, remorselessness is carried to the pitch of crime. And I have here, for now that I mentioned to you already, Philby led to the death through betrayal to as many as 300 fellow agents during the course of his career, apparently without blinking an eye. The whole situation, Freud says, can be summarized, can be completely summarized in a formula. The object, i.e. the new idealized system, has been put in the place of the ego ideal, i.e. the superego. End of quote. If we add to the above the changes brought about by joining the group, we can understand what a powerful combination this can become. In the words of Le Bon, quoted by Freud in Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, and this is a quote, whoever be the individuals that compose it, the fact that they have been transformed into a group puts them in possession of a sort of collective mind which makes them feel, think, and act in a manner quite different from that in which individual of them would feel, think, and act were he in a state of isolation. That has a lot to do with Al-Qaeda and the more recent group of terrorist organizations. It is my opinion that this could explain what we see happen in the case of the genuine malignant traitor, and that much of what I told you today applies to the native terrorists as well, the type of terrorists. Thus, they substitute more or less extensive parts of their superego standards by those of the new leader, which in any given case may be an individual, but sometimes it's not an individual, it's an ideology, as is happening today, or even more important, a combination of both. The latter seems to have been the case in many instances of treason of the spiced varieties, such as Philby, Fush, and others. It was so too with Mappé. These processes are facilitated by certain predisposing factors in the makeup of the personality of the genuine traitor. First, consider the inordinate disappointment in the father and the concomitant hate. There is here a peculiar inbuilt structural conflict between introjects that are acquired from a person that is marked simultaneously to be betrayed and possibly destroyed. This perhaps creates some sort of lack of stability in this type of introjects, and in some form facilitates its substitution under appropriate conditions by a radically different set of introjects. Second, there is a perennial difficulty with the maintenance of sufficient self-regard and self-esteem. Yet the new introject changes the situation in important ways that we have seen. I believe that it is factors like these that explain not only the changes observed, but the remarkable stability that some of the new introjects acquire. In the cases of Philby, McLean, and Burbus, they lasted a lifetime, and during it they were able to deal the most severe blows to the country's friends, and democracy. Treason and terrorism seems as a ubiquitous phenomenon capable of manifesting itself in large varieties of scenarios. That is, from national and international politics, where the consequence may well change the course of history, to corporate or departmental politics in industries, campuses, and so on, where though the consequences may not be as dramatic as in the previous cases, the disruption and potential damage is still significant enough. Let me just conclude with a couple of thoughts about terrorism. There are two types of terrorism, as I told you, the native and the foreign terrorism. The native terrorist essentially follows the same mechanism that I described for you to the genuine traitor. That's what it is. There's absolutely no difference. The foreign terrorist is a completely different situation. These people, what these native terrorists do as adults, you know, these people have been bred to develop ideas, evil ideas, and super evil ideas. That it's a clash of cultures, let's face it. I mean, it started in the Crusades, and I don't know when it will end, but it's still going on. Among the extremists, don't take me wrong, I believe, like most Americans do, that most Muslims are decent people, and that is a decent, good religion. Get to, like Christianity, taken to an extreme, they are both enormously dangerous, and have shown the capacity to be enormously dangerous many times. So these people have been developed as personalities, character structures, and so on, in ways where we are the enemy. We are the evil in the world. We are the devil. We need to be exterminated, and they are willing, as you can see, to give their lives for their causes. Very few of us will do that on this side of the fence, except for the heroes in our armies. Many of us probably are not willing to go there and fight it, but we send other people to do that for us. These people don't send anybody. They come themselves, and they come as individuals. That gives you an idea of the enormous power of these ethical, super ego introjects and ideas that they have. It's awesome. Are determined. It's like a robot. They are now have a cause. They are going to follow it. They are going to do what they are trained to do, what they believe is good to do, let alone than in the extremist position of some of these terrorist groups. As you know, they add to this mixture. They believe that if you do your job this way, you will have a large number of vestal virgins waiting for you, that Allah will provide for you the moment you hit there. I'm afraid that they'll be very surprised if they get anywhere once they are there. But of course you don't know that while you are alive. So essentially that is what I wanted to tell you today. And if you have some questions, I try to answer them. Thank you for your attention.